to the organizers of NOS for inviting us and giving us this opportunity of sharing with this esteemed group of professionals some of the concerns that are being raised in the legal circles in regard to the law governing Earth observation in general, but specifically for legal consideration, we will really be concentrating more on remote sensing as a process to acquire the imagery that you are all using at the moment. As the good doctor has already indicated, Earth observation and space use is really an international activity, an international space activity. Therefore, it's governed by international legal instruments. And the primary legal instrument, as already been stated, is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which provides the legal basis for the use of outer space. For instance, in Article 1, it is stated that outer space, as a province of all humankind, should be used in a non-discriminatory manner on the basis of equality of nations. It should be used for the benefit of all mankind, and specifically to encourage peace and facilitate international cooperation. And as we can see, from 1967 to today, these principles are being realized with the establishment of GEOS in South Africa. Aspect of it, which is an international cooperation in advancement of the peaceful uses of outer space, as well as the benefit of all mankind. In essence, the Outer Space Treaty has already developed so further and accepted generally in the space community such that it can be accepted as a customary international law. So every space user, when they look at the legal consideration, the first point of departure is to look at the Outer Space Treaty and see in that particular area which principles can be extracted and applied. Now, remote sensing, as a specific application or use of outer space, has got its own legal framework, as already being outlined, that there is a treaty on the registration of objects, there's the treaty on the rescue of astronauts. All those treaties are derived from the general principles contained in the Outer Space Treaty. As we can see, the dominant theme in the Magna Carta of space is international cooperation in the use of outer space. Our point of departure is a little bit more recent than what the doctor said about lawyers being eaten by dinosaurs. It's more at the use of outer space by the Sputnik 1 in 1957 by Yuri Gagarin that propelled the international community to sit and try to look at the legal roadmap for the use of outer space. Hence, 5 years down the line, there were principles adopted by the United Nations. Those principles were later turned into the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Now, after they've done the other treaties dealing with the various areas of outer space as demanded by the times, remote sensing got to be a real issue in the late 70s with the launch of Landsat system. And the issue there was then again, how do we enhance the practical and widespread use of this new technology? The propelling factors again there were the benefits derived out of remote sensing applications, the practical applications that were coming out, and the need for a wide distribution of data. Now, even at that time now, there was already a diverse user community in space, as opposed to the earlier part where it was government actors that were involved in space use. At this point in the 70s and early 80s, private actors were coming into play, and now the lines of accountability were getting to be a bit fuzzy, hence the need now to regulate the use and application and dissemination of remote sensing imagery. So the 1986 through the body that the good doctor has identified, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space developed the principles, the 1986 UN Principles on Remote Sensing. That is now the international overarching framework where the principles in respect to the use of remote sensing are outlined. The principles, unlike the 1967 US OST treaty, it's not a treaty, so therefore they're not binding legally. However, having been discussed and negotiated and adopted at the body like the United Nations, there is then a general consensus as to their valid application and acceptance worldwide. Whilst they are not actually binding as such, every nation that is a remote sensing nation, when they develop their policies, they always refer and vow that they are applying the principles as contained in the 1986 UN principles. So few of the principles contained in that declaration, for instance, in the preamble, it again emphasizes the need for international cooperation in the remote sensing arena. Article 1 just describes the types of data that the principles relate to. Principle 2 again re-emphasizes the principles contained in the OST treaty to say remote sensing must be used for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. But then there's that additional element that came in the UN that it has to be irrespective of the degree of economic, social, scientific, and technological advancement, taking into particular consideration the needs of the developing countries. So again, the need for international cooperation is outlined and emphasized in Principle 5. And there's a requirement under Article 5 that sensing states shall promote international cooperation in the use of remote sensing, and they are required, again, to make available to other states opportunities for participation in remote sensing on mutually acceptable terms. Another important principle that we like to highlight is Principle 11, that again speaks about exactly the kinds of activities esteemed professionals are involved in. Remote sensing should promote the protection of humankind from natural disasters. To that extent, we've got a disasters charter that provides for a triggering mechanism in case of a natural disaster where information that is available to a certain country should be made available as speedily as possible to a disaster-stricken country. I saw yesterday Cameroon has been flooded and the US GCIS triggered the charter to make available processed information in regards to the disaster that has struck northern Cameroon. So in that sense, there is adherence to the United Nations 1986 principles on remote sensing by sensing states, and that's what they're doing here with the Disasters Charter. Another principle that I think is of great importance, it's the application, the principle on how should states and actors acquire remote sensing data. Principle 12 prescribe that a sense state shall have access to primary and processed data as soon as such data is available. So if Lancet has taken imagery of South Africa yesterday, they are required under the principles to ensure that that particular imagery is available to the South African actors in as reasonably fast manner as possible. And again, the principle is that this should be applied on a non-discriminatory basis to each and every country, and it must be done on reasonable cost terms. This principle is the one in application today that has led to a number of issues, as we shall see. As we stated earlier, these principles are very persuasive. What we are saying is that sensing states now have decided to adopt and interpret these laws in a very restrictive manner. It's no longer as non-discriminatory, as open, requiring now an intervention from international organization as GEOS, which has developed its own principles, but those principles again reflect the tenor of the 1986 UN principles, in the sense of there's a need for full and open exchange of data. Data must be made available immediately with a minimum time delay according to GEOS, and consideration of cost there, because it's now government, they must be at reasonable cost or at no cost at all. So that now leads us to whether or not in South Africa we've got legislation that deals specifically with remote sensing. Remote sensing as a space activity for a country to make national law in respect to outer space activity must have some jurisdictional basis. The good doctor has already mentioned Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty requires that a state bears international responsibility, must authorize any actor, national actor, who wants to develop space capability. And once they've authorized that, there's continuing supervision required through the licensing mechanism. So now the national state, like South Africa, will look at Article 6 when they develop their domestic legislation, as has already been mentioned.